let's get started. All right, so good morning, everybody. I hope you're all well, even those who haven't shown up yet in front of the screen. Um, Today, since this is our last class of the summer session, I'd like us to consider a subject that we started with, if you remember, in the spring on Zoom, which is the way the coronavirus pandemic has challenged the traditional conceptions in the field of foreign policy. Conception that we've been taken for granted basically since the end of World War II, and particularly since the end of the Cold War in the early 90s. And the lessons that can be learned in order to avoid a reoccurrence of such disastrous consequences of infectious diseases worldwide. But let me first start and respond to the question put to me, if you remember, last week on Belarus, with some information on the political and economic situation in that country. A country which indeed does very seldom makes the media headlines, and thus is relatively unknown. And Michel is going to put up Belarus's map on the screen. By a very strange coincidence, actually, Belarus, which is a landlocked country of about 10 million, as you can see it on the map. Thank you, Michel. Surrounded by Russia, Ukraine, Poland, and a couple of Baltic states, Lithuania and Latvia, in northwestern Europe, has been in the news in the past few days for the arrest of dozens of Russian military contractors who are accused by the Belarusian officials of planning to destabilize Belarus ahead of the country's presidential election scheduled for next Monday, August 10th, and further escalate the political tensions at the present time between Russia and Belarus. The current 65-year-old president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, who's been running Belarus with an iron fist since its independence in 1994, which earned him, by the way, the unenviable nickname of Europe's last dictator, is seeking a sixth five-year term. A former State Farm director, Lukashenko stayed in power all these years by cracking down on dissent and free media, and extending his rule through votes which are perceived as rigged in the West. In other words, using similar methods to those used by his on-again, off-again ally, close ally in the Kremlin. Also, Lukashenko's casual approach to the COVID-19 that he labeled as nothing more than a psychosis, he said, which is intended to turn things upside down in his country, and that required no particular safety measures. As a matter of fact, Belarus is the only European country, with Sweden to some extent, that remained open for business as usual throughout the outbreak. This casual approach has come, however, at a heavy price. Despite only occasional testing for the virus, Belarus has reported close to 60,000 cases of coronavirus, compared with about 32,000, in other words, just a little more than a half, in neighboring Poland, which has 4 times its population. And the World Bank predicted a 4% contraction of the country's economy, the highest in 25 years. But despite the wave of opposition and protest fueled by public fatigue, in a way, with his rule, and the painful economic fallout from the pandemic, Lukashenko is expected to easily win a 6th term in what is supposed to be just another rigged election, in a race, by the way, in which he runs practically unopposed, having barred his 2 main challengers from appearing on the ballot on charges of financial wrongdoing. Once praised by a large segment of the population for keeping Belarus stable and avoiding the kind of turmoil and mass unemployment seen across much of the former Soviet Union in the 1990s, Lukashenko is also facing a mounting criticism for the increased corruption prevailing in the country. And if at home Lukashenko has succeeded to impose his presence by, I would say, traditional methods, cracking down on the opposition and limiting the rule of law, his recipe for international recognition was simple, if not original. Manipulate skillfully the rivalry between East and West. For example, as a long-standing proponent of Russian President Putin's idea to merge Belarus and Russia into a so-called union state, a merger only partly implemented in the 1990s with the removal of immigration and customs controls at their shared borders. This merger was never completed, as the fusion of legislature, flag, anthem, army, and currency, which also had been suggested at the time, had not happened as planned. Nevertheless, at that time, Lukashenko's Belarus was by far Russia's closest and friendliest ally among all the ex-communist republics that had formed the Soviet Union. That enabled Belarus also to generate at least 10% of its gross national domestic product, the GDP, by buying crude oil at discount rates from Russia, processing it at home, and then selling it to Europe at market rates, pocketing the difference. That game, however, ended last year when Russia started demanding market rates for its crude, following the global slump in oil prices, triggered partly by the global economic slowdown, particularly in China, and exacerbated by the pandemic earlier this year. Lukashenko became furious with Russia's new energy prices and started signaling to Washington his willingness to shift alliances and move closer to the United States, convinced that he can blunt Western criticism of his crackdown at home by presenting it as a necessary response to Russia's allegedly meddling in his presidential campaign. And just to make sure, Lukashenko has recently turned to China, which, unlike Western countries, as you very well know, makes no demands on him to ease domestic repression or respect human rights. Belarus is reportedly close to securing a loan of more than $500 million from China, and Chinese money has financed new roads, power plants, and hotels, particularly in Minsk, which is the capital of Belarus. On the cultural front, Lukashenko also started trumpeting his country's ancient roots, which is a complete turnaround from the official policy of yesteryears that discouraged the promotion of a national identity, which was seen as subversive project sponsored by his political opponents, opposed to his close ties with Russia. It is only after Moscow's annexation of Crimea and invasion of eastern Ukraine, on the pretext of defending the Russian-speaking populations who, according to the official terms used by the Kremlin, belong to the Ruski Mir, which means in Russian, the Russian world. It is only then that Lukashenko started changing his stand by promoting the Belarusian history and culture. Now, it should be said that the territory that is now Belarus underwent partition and changed its hand repeatedly over time and frequently over time. So we are not going to go back there. So 6 or 7 centuries back, part of Belarus was administered by Lithuania. Then part of Belarus was administered by Poland. Then Russia took over eastern Belarus at some point. So as a result, much of the history of Belarus is inseparable from that of neighboring countries, Russia, obviously, but also Lithuania and Poland, as I just mentioned. Let me give you a few interesting facts about Belarus. Belarus has 2 official languages, Belarusian and Russian. Belarusian is only studied, or was only studied. Now this is changing also, according to Lukashenko's whim. Belarusian was only studied as a separate subject at school, while all the other classes, as well as official documentation, were conducted in Russian. As a result, which is an interesting fact, very few Belarusians, very few people in Belarusia speak Belarusian, which, though belonging to the same group of Slavic languages as Russian, has some significant differences. And Russians cannot understand Belarusians well, especially if authentic Belarusian terms are used. However, Belarusians can understand Russians perfectly and they speak it fluently because almost all of them are bilingual, having learned Russian in school and speaking it at home. In terms of population, ethnic Belarusians make up about 4/5 of the 10 million people, followed by ethnic Russians, who come in second at about 10%, and then, to no surprise, Ukrainians and Poles. The Jewish community was the second largest group before World War II. But there are practically none left since the occupation of Belarus during the war by the Germans. Belarus's economy is world's 72nd largest, with a relatively well-developed industrial base inherited from the breakup of the USSR, as well as a broad agricultural sector. Also, Belarus has become Eastern Europe's Silicon Valley, so to speak. Among its IT companies, for instance, EPAM is registered on the New York Stock Exchange. And the application Viber is now the third most popular messenger after Facebook Messenger and WhatsApp. So without going into details on Belarus, I hope that these snippets of information have been useful for a better understanding of that country, which indeed does not appear very often in the news. And that might give you the feeling, and probably it's the real one, is that by now you know more about Belarus than 99% of the American population. Now, let's move back to the coronavirus. First, let me just say that when the so-called Spanish flu ravaged the world in 1918, global health government and governance was still in its infancy. At the time, public health was mostly a national and local matter until the mid-19th century, I'd say, when revolutions in transport deepened global integration to an unprecedented degree. For instance, in 1851, European countries hosted the first international sanitary conference devoted to managing cholera. Over the next 6 decades, till the beginning of the 20th century, governments would hold a number of conferences, negotiate multilateral treaties on infectious diseases, and establish new international organizations, including the Pan American Sanitary Bureau and the Office International d'Hygiène Publique, International Bureau of Public Health. Yet these arrangements focused on sanitation were no match for the Spanish flu. The lack of meaningful international coordination to combat the pandemic left each government to fend for itself. The rest is history. As you know, the outbreak quickly became the deadliest public health emergency in modern times, killing an estimated 50 million people worldwide. Today, the lack of global health infrastructure is no longer an issue. After World War II, in particular, countries created a robust machinery to manage international public health emergencies. They established hundreds of multilateral organizations and signed thousands of treaties to manage the shared dilemma of rising interdependence. Among the most prominent of the new instruments was the World Health Organization, or the WHO, created as a UN specialized agency in 1948. Now, since 2000 in particular, WHO has risen markedly in importance as various new and re-emerging infectious diseases have threatened global health and security. The agency managed more or less successfully the global response to the severe acute respiratory syndrome in 2003, the H1N1 flu pandemic in 2009, the Ebola epidemic in 2014, 2016, and the Zika epidemic in 2015, 2016. In the wake of SARS, the severe acute respiratory syndrome, WHO also strengthened its international health regulations, the famous IHR, which is a core legal set of regulations governing state conduct with respect to infectious disease. The new regulations gave WHO, among other things, the authority to declare a public health emergency of international concern and required member states to increase their pandemic response capacities. Meanwhile, an entire multilateral range of global public health arrangements emerged alongside WHO, including the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, the Global Health Security Agenda, and the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, just to name a few. The result is a global health infrastructure beyond the widest dreams of the national leaders who confronted the 1918 influenza pandemic alone. And yet, the WHO remains deeply flawed, beset by multiple institutional shortcomings that diminish its ability to coordinate pandemic response. Blame rests partly with the WHO membership, as well as large charities, which have pressed the organization to expand its agenda without providing it with commensurate resources. Now, such shortcomings have prompted observers to conclude that failure is inevitable that in times of crisis, citizens will look to their own leaders and governments will care for their own citizens at the expense of global concerns. But the record of other crises in recent years, especially the last global financial crisis, suggests that sovereign states are quite capable of coordinating responses to shared global challenges, provided that their leaders take an enlightened view of their country's long-term national interests. For instance, in 2008, 2009, President Bush at the time and then President Obama led a cooperative international response to the global credit crunch, helping prevent the world's descent into another Great Depression. And in 2009, Bush convened the first ever meeting of the leaders of the G20, which is a group that comprises the world's most important established and emerging economies. And a year later, in 2009, President Obama spent his first year in office coordinating with the rest of the world massive stimulus packages to restore global liquidity and expanding the resources and mandates of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. That disparity in action and reactions, a collective effort to resolve the financial crisis on the one side, and a rather dispersed reaction to face the sanitary crisis, can also be partly attributed to the fact that infectious diseases evoke far more fear than most other international threats, and reinforce, in a way, a primal instincts to impose barriers and withdraw into smaller groups. Pandemics may be transnational, but they are fought in the first instance by local communities seeking to protect themselves. That being said, this is no justification for the weaknesses displayed in this instance by the WHO, whose overall poor performance has been attributed to a number of factors. The first is structural. Entrusted with an increasingly expansive global mandate, the agency's annual budget is a meager $2.2 billion, which is smaller than many major US hospitals. The chronic lack of funding led to a shortage of deployable staff and logistical capacity, as well as a failure to cultivate and develop relationships with other UN agencies, with the private sector, and with the NGOs, with non-governmental organizations. The pandemic also revealed the failure of its members, or WHO member states, to comply fully with the international health regulations that I just mentioned. Those regulations required all member states to develop and maintain minimum core capabilities to prevent, detect, and respond to disease outbreaks. And yet, 15 years later, fewer than half of all member states are in compliance. And many nations still lack even rudimentary surveillance and laboratory capacities to detect outbreaks. Even more troubling, member states can impose emergency measures that diverge from WHO guidelines in their early responses if those governments believe that their own measures will produce superior results. In the early responses to the virus, governments repeatedly use this clause to impose border closure, travel bans, visa restrictions, and quarantines, regardless of whether these measures had WHO endorsement or any basis in science, and more importantly, without any coordination with the rest of the world. Many did not even bother to inform the WHO, forcing it to glean information from media sources. Other international fora have not performed any better. The leaders of the G7, which represents the world's most developed economies, failed to meet until early March. And even then, they did little more than highlight their respective border closures. Later that month, a meeting of the G7 foreign ministers ended up in acrimony when US partners rejected Washington's demand that the final communique refer to the virus as the Wuhan coronavirus after the Chinese city where it was first discovered. The G20 that I also mentioned earlier operated on a similar timeline, convening to discuss the pandemic for the first time in late March, nearly 3 months into the outbreak. At the virtual summit, the parties rejected requests from the International Monetary Fund to double its resources and suspend the debt obligation of poor nations. And finally, the UN Security Council remained missing in action. China, which held the rotating presidency of the Council in March, blocked it from considering any resolution about the pandemic, arguing that public health matters fell outside the Council's geopolitical authority, claim that is totally untrue. In 2014, for instance, the Security Council had passed a resolution designating the Ebola epidemic at the time a threat to international peace and security. It is thus tempting to assume that multilateral institutions are at best less effective than advertised, and at worst, doomed to fail when they are needed most. The truth, however, is somewhat different. Multilateral institutions, and I said that many times, are what states and their leaders make of them. The spectacular failure of various mechanisms of global health governance is primarily due to the ambivalence of states, torn between their desire for effective international institutions and their insistence on independent action. After the outbreak of the pandemic, governments have repeatedly forsaken opportunities for consultation, for joint planning, and collaboration, opting instead to adopt nationalist stances that have put them at odds with one another and with the WHO. In China, the initial epicenter of the pandemic, the leadership was slow to report the outbreak and, as you know, resisted full transparency thereafter. What's more, its initial the initial, what's more, it initially rebuffed offers from the WHO and the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to provide desperately needed scientific expertise in epidemiology and virology. China was also slow to share transmission data and biological samples with the WHO. The US approach to the pandemic was not beyond reproach either. Following his America First instincts, President Trump has adopted a nationalist response, framing COVID-19 not as a threat to global public health, but as an assault on the sovereignty of the United States and the safety of its citizens. At the end of January, he ordered the closing of the US borders to foreigners who had recently traveled to China. And in March, without consulting US allies, he abruptly suspended air travel from Europe to the United States. And once again, without any attempt to coordinate a response with the rest of the world. In a more cosmopolitan world, other leaders might have filled the vacuum left by Beijing's constant obstruction and Washington's unilateral isolation. But this is not the world in which the crisis has taken shape. Global public health, which was long insulated from geopolitical rivalry and nationalist grandstanding, has suddenly become a political combat, fueled by the rise of authoritarian leaders and the diminishing public support for international cooperation. One lesson that will emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic is that multilateral cooperation can seem awfully abstract until you actually need it, whether you rely on it to flatten the curve of the epidemic, ensure the safety of airline travel, protect displaced people, or prevent another global economic meltdown. Another harder lesson is that the multilateral system is not a self-regulating autonomous machine that springs into action whenever needed. No amount of technocratic expertise or institutional reform can compensate for the current lack of political vision. While all governments share a fundamental interest in a multilateral system that can respond quickly and effectively to stop potential pandemics in their tracks, they are far less enthusiastic when it comes to delegating any of their sovereignty to the WHO or any other international forum, or even granting it the authority and capabilities to coordinate a pandemic response. If the current crisis causes policymakers to conclude that multilateralism is doomed, then humanity might set itself up for another more costly calamities in the future. If the crisis instead serves as a wake-up call and will represent an incentive to invest in a more effective multilateral system, which is definitely flawed and needs correction, then the world will be far better prepared when the next global pandemic will strike. So these are a few comments that I wanted to make to you on the on the current virus, and we see where we are going from here. I don't know to what extent the private sector is coordinating its own efforts worldwide to come up with a cure, with a treatment, with a vaccine for it. What I can see is there are some information popping up here and there about a vaccine that has to be found or which is allegedly efficient, but I do not see a lot of coordination. Obviously, every large pharmaceutical company is trying to come up with with a treatment and solution which would be financially rewarding. So I don't know where the cooperation will come from, but definitely we haven't seen much cooperation at the governmental level. And one more point I like to make, because I'm aware, I mentioned the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. And I'm aware that very few people understand the difference between the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. It's very confusing, and even for the people within the system, they don't always understand what's the difference between the two UN agencies. The two UN agencies were established in Bretton Woods, which is a small place in New Hampshire, as you know, back in 1948. And the difference, the main difference, I'm simplifying. The main difference between the two is that the World Bank is basically a development institution, while the International Monetary Fund is a lending institution. Now, what's the difference? Both institutions are administering a pool of money. Now, the bank is lending, is giving money to promote social economy, to promote social and economic development, basically for people to live better lives, for people in what used to be called third world countries, and which are called today developing countries. It started basically, the idea when the bank was created, the World Bank, was to create a bank for the development, the economic development and recovery of Western Europe and Europe in general after World War II. But it was Western Europe more than the rest of Europe, because once the Eastern Europe was cut off by USSR from Western Europe, no monies from the West reached Eastern Europe. So it was basically Western Europe. The idea is to give money for the development of infrastructures in different countries, today mostly in developing countries. The IMF, on the other hand, is the overseer of its members' monetary and exchange policies. It also, as I said, administers a pool of money which members can borrow, from which members can borrow. In exchange, however, those states are required to follow and implement financial measures and policies advocated by the IMF, by the International Monetary Fund. So in a way, there are strings attached to the monies that the IMF grants to different projects in different countries. Now, those projects can be in developing countries or developed countries. The IMF looks at all the projects that are submitted to it and then makes a decision on the amount and on the conditions on which it lends money to different countries. But again, they can be developing countries or developed countries. It doesn't depend on the state of the country. Obviously, a developing country will need probably more money than a developed country. But the IMF looks mostly at the feasibility of a project and what it entails. Whereas the bank is mostly geared to give money to the developing countries. I don't know if that is clear, but that is the main difference. Now, another thing traditionally is that the bank, ever since their inceptions, the bank is always has as a chief an American national, and IMF has a national from another country than the United States. Most of the time, European. So you have an idea about the difference between the two. All right, so this is it. I open the floor. I see already the floor, so to speak, is open. Good morning, Steve. In the US, we refer to the 1918 flu as the Spanish flu. Is it referenced that way in the rest of the world? I understand it is not, though, that it had started in Spain. I don't know. Yes, to answer your first question, yes, it is referred to as Spanish flu elsewhere also. But it is not evidenced that the Spanish flu started in Spain. The reason why it is called Spanish flu, and I think I mentioned that when I brought up the Spanish flu back in the spring, is that the Spanish flu broke out during World War I, as you know. And most countries which were involved in the war, including the United States, most headlines were particularly depressing for the public opinion, with losses on the front and human casualties. So in order to avoid to depress the population even further, there was no mention at all made of the Spanish flu, not in the beginning. The only country where the media openly mentioned the Spanish flu was Spain, because Spain was neutral during World War I. So the media and the government of Spain did not care whether the Spaniards would they couldn't get bad news from the front because there were no Spanish soldiers involved. But it was abundantly reported by the media, Spanish media, about the flu. That's why, generally, it is believed that's why the Spanish flu is called the Spanish flu. Not necessarily because it started in Spain. And the origin of the Spanish flu actually is still a mystery today. Peggy, can you comment on Russia's claim that they'll be vaccinating its people with vaccines this fall. I cannot. I cannot probably. The Kremlin knows more about it than I do. I didn't see the claim by the government, and I don't know where it comes from. So I cannot comment on it. I don't know what kind of vaccines the Russians have secured, if it's safe enough to be injected to people. I have absolutely no idea. Well, when we probably we have a clearer picture, Peggy, when we reconvene in the fall. I don't know. Alan, are both IMF and World Bank agencies under the aegis of the UN? Yes. How are the leadership of the two agencies selected? Well, they have a board, and but obviously there is pressure by different governments who have their own candidates for the position. But as I told you, generally speaking, there is a gentleman's agreement for the IMF to have a European leader most of the time. Actually, today it is Christine Lagarde. No, it used to be Christine Lagarde, who was French, budget financial minister at some point in Sarkozy's government a few years ago. And today, I don't know actually who replaced her, but generally speaking, it's a European. And the bank has, well, the IMF also has as chief, as you very well know, because him you must have heard of, Dominique Strauss, who had an unfortunate incident in New York City and was arrested a few years ago. He was French also. He is still French, but he's not the head of the IMF any longer. He had, if you remember, an unfortunate sexual encounter in New York City and was arrested, and then it went to trial, or before trial they settled somehow. So, and the bank also, I don't know who's heading the bank today, but it used to be a former minister or secretary in the Bush administration, it seemed to me. David, this may be unrelated. Can you give your opinion about the removal of US troops from Germany and why this has been a long-term goal of Putin? Just a second, scrolling back. Removal of, and why this has been a long-term goal of Putin. Thank you for a wonderful course. Thank you very much, Rita. And we hope you will repeat it in the fall. Will you repeat it in the, well, repeat it, no, it won't be the same topic every week, but yes, we are scheduled to be back in the fall and in the future. At least I hope. Yes, the virus and the removal of the troops are definitely unrelated. Well, I don't know to what extent this is a wish of Putin to have 9,000 American troops removed from Germany. But obviously, in general, the fewer American troops you have, or boots on the ground, US boots on the ground you have in Europe, the happier will the other side will be. That being said, I do not believe that. I think this is more like a symbolic gesture than a real strategic one, because I don't believe that 10,000 troops will make a whole lot of a difference in today's world and the military situation. I don't believe that it's so relevant. More and more countries concentrate on having fewer human resources, so to speak, in the military, but a much higher technological capability, which will compensate for the lack of people. When pressing a button will do more damage probably than having 1,000 or 10,000 people in one place. That being said, it does have a political symbol. It shows, number one, it comes before the election. So every time that American troops are removed from somewhere, this is a promise that Trump made to his constituency back in 2016. So it shows that the president keeps his promises. Number one, that's for domestic purposes. And internationally, obviously, the relationship between Germany and the United States is not what has been or should be because of Germany's refusal to live up to its financial contribution to NATO. So President Trump is trying to signal his discontent with the German position, moving, some of them will be brought back to the United States, but I think I mentioned that also a couple of weeks ago. We should talk more of a redeployment, actually, of American troops from Germany rather than withdrawal. Yes, they will be withdrawn from Germany, but no, they won't be all of them brought back to the United States. Some of them will be redeployed next door in Poland. So this is also one way for the current administration to show its pleasure with Poland and its military buildup. Poland is obviously much more sensitive to any type of Russian intervention or meddling or having known what the Russian system or the Soviet system, I should say, brought to their country. So this is one way to reward, in a way, Poland and show Germany then yes, the US has its real allies back, but will not continue to finance and back governments which do not comply with their obligations, basically. Doug, Pierre, I'm not saying the US should necessarily tout itself as doing a highly admirable job in handling this toxic pandemic. That's for sure. However, it's a bit unclear as to the comments about how well Europe has handled it. The fact that the US has not cooperated with the rest, well, number one, you expect from the United States, whether you like it or not, as a leading power in the world, to show the example. And it has always, in cases like this, has taken the lead. And in this particular case, it was also expected that once the virus became known, to take the lead in trying to have a coalition of countries doing the same thing at the same time. Now, the fact that the US has reacted a little late can be attributed to a number of reasons that I mentioned already previously, and I'm not going to go back to it, primarily China's unwillingness to disclose very valuable information, the fact that WHO went along with the Chinese position for a relatively long time. That doesn't mean that Europe did a better job than the United States. I have not implied that in any shape or fashion. Europe is not doing any better than the United States in that respect. The hospitals in Europe were just as overwhelmed with patients as the American hospitals. They had a number of deaf people, which equals, when compared to their total population, to that of the United States. What makes domestically speaking, as I explained it the last time when we spoke about the virus, what makes the position of the federal government in this country so difficult is that we have not seen a federal policy in terms of a coherent, I should say, federal policy in the fight against the virus. We saw the federal policy give some vague direction, and then every state doing its own thing. As a result, you can see the result today. Some of the states retreated, they come back on the deconfinement that they put in place, particularly those who are in the front line of deconfinement, like Texas and Florida, just to take a couple of examples. In the face of the number of new cases coming in every day, they retreating a little bit, and they go back to confinement. New York State and the tri-state area in particular, which suffered a number of extremely high number of casualties in the beginning, seems to be doing better now. But again, every state in this country is doing its own thing in terms of virus. And probably the federal state should have come up with a federal overall harmonized and coordinated policy with the rest of the country before giving out some disconcerting and sometimes opposing vague directions as to how to fight it. Again, I'm not saying Europe did any better. And Europe does not have the excuse of the United States of being a federal state, except for Germany. But generally speaking, in Germany, even they follow closely the central administration. In addition, in this country, and it's very unfortunate, as I mentioned in my presentation, the pandemic happens in an election year, and it's being used, as you can see very well from the media and what you hear and what you read, as a political tool. and that is extremely dangerous. And it's very bad for the American people in general, that not even on a subject so universal, because we are not talking politics here. Again, this pandemic does not know borders and does not go preferably to illiberal countries and liberal countries, or developed countries rather than developing countries. It goes everywhere, across borders, and it strikes everywhere. So to have used this as a political tool, particularly here, and particularly because it's an election year, is unfortunate. Is unfortunate, and it will have consequences, because I'm afraid that in the future, in a similar case, it's going to start all over again. So this is particularly unfortunate domestically for the United States, and for its ability to deal with it in a more coordinated manner, if you will. Laurie, unfortunate, he was accused of raping a hotel maid. Yeah, you're talking about Dominique Strauss-Kahn, yes. From Davida, from where do IMF funds come? Basically from member states. And they're raising funds from member states, from the private sector, and so on. And obviously they are paid back, but that's where the funds come from. As well as from the IMF and the World Bank. There was a report from Mark. There was a report of a large number of Chinese fishing boats threatening the wildlife preserve in Galapagos Islands near Ecuador. Do you have any information about it? I do not, Mark, but what I do know indeed, that there is a lot of Chinese money indeed put in Ecuador. And that has been going on for 3 or 4 years. Ecuador had a president who was a leftist, a very close ally of the Bolivian Morales. If you remember, Morales fled Bolivia because he was accused of having rigged the elections to get elected for a third term. And for that, he amended the constitution of his country, which was illegal. So he was in a way overthrown. So Ecuador was a close friend of Bolivia, and those two countries were leaning a lot to the left. And what happened in Ecuador is that last year they had elections, and the incumbent president, who couldn't run any longer, Correa, I think is his name, his successor lost the election. So now Ecuador has a center to the right government, and is more assertive and more vocal about the Chinese investment there. We start knowing more about it. So I'm not surprised by this information, but I don't know, I haven't seen anything about it. From Larry, Kristalina Georgieva is the head of the, okay. Thank you, Larry, for this clarification. Georgieva is a Bulgarian national, I think, who's been with the United Nations for a while, or with the Bulgarian government also. Okay. From Doug, the UK has had a terrible time with fatalities in the population. Adjusted basis is considerably higher than us. Italy was practically cleared off the map. Well, with an average of descendants around 80. Spain is still struggling. France results unclear to me, still testing continuing to be low. Yes, overall, Doug, you give a correct picture of what's going on in Europe. They are absolutely not out of the woods. And again, far from me to insinuate in any shape or fashion that Europe has done better in dealing with the virus than the United States. And the United States, I mean, they cannot receive lessons from any other country on the way to manage this scourge. That being said, once again, and do not ever forget it, the whole world in a situation of crisis is looking up to the United States for answers. No matter what the public statements will be, no matter how much opposition or resentment the United States will trigger by doing this or that on the world stage. The world will always, I don't want to use the term always, the Roman Empire has fallen also. So, but has been looking up to the United States to always find solutions for global problems. And this time, it seems to me that the US preferred, in a way, and I'm not faulting, I want you to make it very clear, I'm not faulting the administration, the current administration, I'm not faulting the other side. I'm just telling you, and that's the way I see it, is that the fact that there was no harmonized and coordinated policy on this with other countries, as well as with within domestically within this country, has made the US quite vulnerable to something that maybe could have been managed differently and more effectively. That's all I said. And I believe that international global cooperation in a case like this, when you have something striking the whole world, it's universal, not one or two or three countries would have been more efficient. That being said, it so happened that the pandemic struck now during an election year. And this particular election year has been extremely tough in every way. So this pandemic became a football. And it's a high price to pay. From Lori, Americans' lack of leadership during this pandemic is jarring. Back in 2014, our CDC took the world lead in fighting the Ebola epidemic, with the WHO following the CDC lead. The result was a very effective worldwide response and control of the outbreak. In fact, Obama responded by creating the Pandemic Response Unit and predict programs to deal with future pandemics, and the special division of the NSC to do the same. Trump canceled the PRU in 2018, canceled PREDICT in 2019, and reorganized NSC and eliminated its pandemic response team in the process. And as late as March 2020, was trying to cut the budget of the CDC by 17%. This with full knowledge that, sorry, that COVID was impending. American presidential leadership really does matter here and abroad. Well, thank you for these details. I didn't really go into them, and I gave it as a general fact. That was my feeling, and indeed, from what you're writing, it seems that my feeling is correct. That being said, again, you seem to be faulting the current administration. The current administration, if we want to be totally objective, publicly, at least from what we know, was fooled, like many other countries in the world, by most countries in the world, by the slowness of reaction of the Chinese government, which for the longest time, after the outbreak, which seems to have occurred not in March or February, as the Chinese had claimed, but back in November or December of 2019. And it appears again from the information that I could glean, that the Chinese authorities were aware of the COVID-19 at the beginning, at least at the beginning of this year. But very slow or unwilling actually to transmit this information first to WHO and then to the rest of the world. So everybody reacted to the pandemic too late by the time the pandemic had traveled. Because by the time these travel restrictions were put in place, a lot of people went back and forth during the Christmas holidays, during vacation time, not only from China, but also people from other parts of the world who happened to have been in China, then they returned to another country, then they came into the United States, and they went somewhere else. So by the time the WHO, which again, for a long time went along with the Chinese claim that this is not transmissible, and this is just a local occurrence, which will be taken care of by the local government, local authorities in China. By that time, when the WHO decreed a global emergency, it was much too late. So panicking, in a way, every country adopted its own set of measures. And that you did not mention in your comments, but it should be to have a fair picture, it should be mentioned. That being said, your conclusion is absolutely on the money. American leadership matters, as I said to you, to every country in the world, no matter whether that country is against the United States publicly or not against the United States, it does matter. And also, unfortunately, again, this happened, and that does matter also. It happened during an election year, which is extremely disputed and controversial in every way, including the health issues. From Alan, well done, Tom. Well done, Tom. It refers to Tom's comment. I just cannot find it. Well, anyway, well done, Tom, from Alan. From Peggy. Thank you for a wonderful series. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Peggy. I look forward to the fall session. Again, let me just mention it, then I'm going back to your questions. For those of you who had other things to do or who are getting out, checking out today, I just want to wish you a healthy, a happy summer, I was going to say, but let's let's be a little less ambitious and wish you a safe summer. And again, I hope to see you all back whenever we go back to school online in the fall. For those who are leaving, for those who are still staying, bearing with me for a little longer, I'm reading your questions. From Tom. Trump's handling of our NATO allies owed monies seems to have an ultimate goal: to offend and damage our relationship with our allies rather than have them make restitution to us. If you and Pierre are longtime friends, if you and I, Pierre, are longtime friends and you owe me money, if I scream at you, pay up your cheap bastard, we are not likely to stay friends for long. The way you ask for something is often just as important as what you are asking for. And diplomacy and tact are usually a proper way to engage your friends and partners. I agree with you, Tom, but let's also be fair and say that the president is not known for his skillful diplomatic skills. And the tone of his voice is not necessarily the one that diplomats use in international fora. That being said, and again, to be totally objective, you get what you're paying for, if I may say so. He never made a secret out of the fact that he was who he was. He was a businessman, and businessmen probably don't address each other when they owe each other money or favors in the same way as diplomats do. Especially if you want to remain on good terms with them, which Trump apparently does not. Well, I wouldn't say that Trump does not want to remain on good terms with the rest of the US partners. He just tells things as he sees them. And obviously they are not very, he's not using diplomatic terms. That being said, let's not exaggerate. The other leaders in Europe are not particularly sensitive to this type of, they are not used to this type of language. But I don't believe, first of all, that the president is addressing them by you owe NATO money, you bastard, speaking to Macron or Merkel or any other leader in Europe or elsewhere. But on the substance, he's right. Europe has been paying more for its own defense, for NATO, than it is doing now. So Obama in his time has also, he was aware of the situation. This has been going on for a very long time. And Obama mentioned that to the European leaders many, many times. But he did it so diplomatically that it got lost in the translation. Nobody really took him seriously, like apparently when he told Putin, speaking of cyber attacks on American interests, cut it out, don't do it anymore. Well, this is cut it out, don't do it anymore. It's not exactly a threat. Well, Trump, having learned from the fact that probably the previous president wasn't forceful enough to impress upon the other leaders that it is time to pay, and having made promises to his constituency, somewhere, especially when he came into power, wanted to show the rest of the world and his constituency, probably more his constituency than the rest of the world, that he's a tough guy. And he seemed to be more forceful than his predecessor. Now, did that help? Not much with Germany, apparently, but again, the jury is out there because Merkel will be leaving next year, and again, Trump's personal relationship with Merkel was awful. So once you have a different chancellor, we'll see what happens with the German-US relationship. And also, let's not forget that many of the threats that Trump made when he became president back at the beginning of 2017 did not materialize, at least not immediately. It took him 2 years to renounce the Iranian nuclear deal. When he was elected, he said, I'm going to get out of it, the worst deal ever. I'm going to get out of it right away as soon as I become president. The inner circle in the White House, the new administration, calmed him down and gave the Iranians another good 2 years to come to the not to come to the negotiating table. The Iranians are ready to negotiate with the US, but what's to negotiate? The terms of negotiations would be, the two parts are, at least publicly, far apart. But they succeeded in making Trump wait for a couple of years before actually taking position and doing something about it. So, and the fact that we withdrew the United States from the climate change treaty, the Paris Climate Change Treaty, also had no effect so far, because it takes 3 years for a country from the time that it gives notice officially to the agency that of its intention to pull out, to withdraw, to the moment where it can actually do it. So it's only at the end of this year or early next year that the US will have pulled out officially of the climate change treaty. And it remains to be seen what happens in November also. So yes, in public and if you will, in his statements, he seems to have offended, quote unquote, against. These are politicians that we're dealing with in Europe, in the United States and elsewhere. So they are used to this kind of behind the curtain stage language. So it's not an issue. And a country is not going to change its positions only because its leader was offended by a comment made by the president. But yes, it's a different language. I agree with you. And the last thing is that if you're such a nice guy, Tom, uh, even though we are not that close friends, I'm going to borrow money from you if you're asking me so nicely to give it back at some point, if you're not going to scream at me. So you can count on me and coming to you for a request. Get ready. From Peggy, divine intervention, maybe? Maybe. From Alan, thank you, Pierre. See you in the fall, hopefully also at the Y. Hopefully, although the Y, I understand, open only the pool. So maybe I'll see you at the pool, which is open actually, starting today, I guess. From Don, thank you for a very informative series. Thank you, Don. From Jack, thank you for another great series, Pierre. Thank you very much, Jack. From Dalida, one more. Regardless of the origins, how does it help to constantly call the virus the Chinese virus? Thank you. It doesn't, but it is. So it doesn't, but it is, and it might help, again, domestically. Again, this is a gimmick. It's not a big deal, but it's a gimmick for it's getting under the skin of the Chinese leadership who got offended. So the more you get offended, the more the president was pushing it. And in the future debate, presidential debates, if there are any before the elections, obviously he will call it the Chinese virus again, which again it is. Laurie, it doesn't help, but it's a fact. Your thoughts on attracting students from the to the Foreign Service in light of all the I cannot see the career diplomats faced during the impeachment trial and the general anti-globalism criticism from extreme right and left. That won't prevent people from going into diplomacy if they like foreign affairs and they like getting involved. I don't think so. This is, Laurie, this is just a period of time, and a short period of time. That will go back to normal. I don't think that it will have any effect, a long-term effect on students who consider going into the diplomatic field later. From Tom, Trump certainly shows plenty of tact, respect, and admiration for Putin and Kim Jong-un. Though he was opposed to Theresa May, Merkel, and Macron. He treats our enemies like they are our allies and our allies like enemies. In Putin's case, Trump is like his performing seal. I always knew you would pay me back the money, Pierre, but that's because I don't treat you like Trump would. Well, I don't know how Trump would treat me, Tom, but unfortunately, I don't owe him any money. He is more in a position, I guess, to lend me money than you are. I don't know. That being said, yes, he again the the dividing line, as I mentioned many times, between so-called allies and foes is blurred and always been in Trump's term. It's first and foremost a transactional type of relationship where you treat your enemy, if your so-called enemies comply or at least go along with the type of, or do not criticize the type of decisions that you make, they are your friends, but it's only temporary. It depends on the issue. It depends on the case. In certain cases, your enemies will be your friends because it's a convenience thing. And in other cases, again, it's transactional. What can you do for me? Or what I can do for you, and how do you pay me back? Not necessarily in loans, but what do I get from you? And it's a totally transactional diplomacy, which has always, diplomacy is also transactional, obviously, but not so openly that it has been under this current administration. But again, he always said, I'm not a politician. I want to bring into the White House a different type of governance. And this is a different type of governance. Now, whether you like it or not, that's a totally different subject. But that's who the president is, and he's not going to change. From Norma, I watched a movie on Netflix about Sergio Vieira de Mello, a UN human rights diplomat. Did you know him at the UN? I met him very briefly at the United Nations, indeed. He was a Brazilian diplomat, and but the movie is not very good. I think there was another movie made much earlier. This movie is a very romanticized version of Sergio de Mello. But there is an earlier movie which was done on him, which was much more accurate in terms of what really, who was Mello and what he did. I met him a couple of times, but he was not based at the UN headquarters. He was all over the place. And his human rights office was in Geneva, in Switzerland. So he came to the UN headquarters here occasionally, but he wasn't based in the city. But the movie, I saw the movie. It's not very good. In terms of, I mean, if you like romance and this side of a girlfriend who's there for well, it's the emphasis is not on his diplomacy so far. The emphasis is on him and his relationship with his assistant, which is not very instructive or informative when it comes to the United Nations. Okay, so I guess we run out of questions for today. No, we haven't. From Sherry, Samantha Power wrote a book about him, Chasing the Flame. Highly recommend. Thank you once again for a very informative. Thank you for listening, I was going to say, coming to it, for listening to it. looking forward to the next session. Why, for every one of you who says looking forward to the next session, that's an encouragement that there will be a next session. I know that Michelle is listening and taking notes. Looking forward to the next session. Until then, wishing health and safety to everyone during this scary time. From Norma, thank you. See you soon. From Tom, translation politics indeed. Transaction politics indeed, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Look for new, thank you, for new Trump golf courses in Moscow, Tel Aviv, Ankara, Pyongyang, and Riyadh. I don't know, in Tel Aviv, they must have already a golf course in Jerusalem. This way, every time he hits a ball, it can go to the wall to the Palestinian side and then be sent back from the Palestinian. Maybe that's one way to restart talks and negotiations. If you get the ball back, what can we get in exchange? You know, this type of thing. From Laurie, thanks Pierre and Michel. Really support same amount of time, not shorter when class resumes. From Donna, thank you so much. From Tom, you're the best, Pierre. Thank you. Thank you very much, Tom. All right, Michelle, I think we reached the end of this session. So you'll have, mostly you'll be getting a break from me for a little while. You don't have to put up, oh my God, Monday is around the corner. I have to spend a couple of hours with this. Thank you very much, Michelle, for your help.
It's a pleasure, Pierre. I learned so much. Thank you.
I haven't learned from you, unfortunately, how to handle the technological part of this. So hopefully I'll come back in the fall, counting on you. I won't accept any other handler. I'm telling you officially now.
I love being your handler.
I'm going to put in an official request if that's what it takes.
Absolutely.
To Katie to have you designated my official backup. Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks, Pierre. Enjoy the rest of your summer.
See you in the fall and keep safe.
I'll be in touch. Thank you. You too. Bye.